Chapter 1. How did the universe begin? Is there an ultimate explanation for the universe? Two ancient stories of the origin of all things. There has recently been a marked growth in the number of firms that offer to trace people's ancestry and genealogy. It seems that many people are interested in knowing their past histories. Knowing where you come from and how you got to where you are tells you something important about yourself. Perhaps knowing your origin will tell you what you really are, your true nature. Many ancient religions share this interest in how things began and how humans came to be. The oldest surviving written religious account of origins comes from Babylonia, roughly modern Iraq. The Enuma Elish, the words mean "when above," and are the first two words of the epic, exists in fragmentary form and has been dated to somewhere between 1000 and 1800 BCE. Representative of a number of Middle Eastern stories of origin, it clearly influenced the account of origins to be found in the Bible, which was written down much later, perhaps in the 6th century BCE. In the Babylonian story, the gods arise from a primal deep or chaos, what the book of Genesis calls tohu wabohu, the great deep, though the compiler of Genesis implies that this sea was itself created by one supreme god. In Babylon, however, all the gods arise from the deep, and there is conflict among them that culminates in a great battle between Marduk, god of the city of Babylon, and Tiamat, the great dragon or serpent of the sea. Not surprisingly, given that the Babylonians wrote the story, Marduk wins and becomes the greatest of the gods. The dragon is defeated, and from her body earth and sky are fashioned. Humans are made from the blood of Kingu, general of her armies, and they are given the job of tilling the earth to provide food for the gods. As an account of the ultimate origin of all things, this is rather disappointing. All forms arise out of the formless deep, but why they should do so, or why they should have the nature they have, is left unexplained. The writer of Genesis accepts the existence of primal chaos, and even of a mysterious dragon of the deep called variously Leviathan or Rahab. Later in the Bible, Psalm 89, 9-10, says, "You, Lord God, rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass." Rahab is crushed, but still lives. But at the last day, the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. The serpent and the saltwater sea remain symbols of a chaotic and destructive force that God needs to limit and order, and that God will finally destroy. So, the writer of the book of Revelation, looking ahead to God's new creation, is finally able to say, "The sea was no more." For the Bible, this is no longer a war of the gods, but there is still the thought that chaos, the threat of the formless, is somehow part of creation. There is also the thought that human nature is somehow corrupted by the chaos dragon, the snake in the garden, before he lost his legs. In the Babylon story, humans are made of demons' blood. They have something of chaos within them, and only the power of Marduk can keep that chaos at bay. In the Babylonian epic, the origins of humanity tell us something about human life. They suggest that it is compounded of destructive chaos and cosmic order. They suggest that humans are part of a constant cosmic conflict in which goodness is hard to find. They suggest that human destiny is governed by the gods, and that the proper human role is to work hard to make the earth fruitful and thereby to serve the greatest of the gods and win his approval. The biblical account reflects many of these themes, but it replaces the gods with one supreme God. And it finds the ultimate origin of the universe not in chaos, but in a personal God who creates because the universe is good or beautiful, in Hebrew, Tob. This does provide a reason for the existence of the universe. To be good is to be an object of rational desire, to be something that is desirable for its own sake. In that sense, goodness requires a being that wants and enjoys the objects of desire, and it requires objects that satisfy rational desires. Consciousness of a beautiful object is a paradigm of goodness, for such consciousness is desirable simply for itself. So to be truly good, there must be an object that is worthy of contemplation, and a consciousness capable of such contemplation. It is always a reason for the existence of something that it is such a consciously apprehended object. God can create the universe as an object of divine contemplation. It would be good for God to do so, and the creation of good is a reason for creating anything. According to the book of Genesis, out of the formless and infinite ocean of possibility, God fashions light, or rather God lets light be, as though God were releasing a possible form of being into existence, allowing it to come into existence from the shapeless realm of mere possibility. Then God created on the planet Earth the atmosphere, the land and its vegetation, sea creatures and birds, animals, and, finally, human beings, made in the image and likeness of God. There have been many interpretations of this phrase, the image of God, but most scholars agree that it implies that humans, like God, have knowledge and creative freedom and share to some degree a responsibility for the care and cultivation of the earth. Most created things are good because they are beautiful, elegant, amazing in form and structure. Humans are good in a special sense because they are fully conscious of that beauty, and they can themselves create beauty in new forms. They can appreciate beauty, the beauty of creation and the beauty of the Creator. They realize and are conscious of the goodness and beauty of the world, and that realization, the contemplative and sensitive awareness of beauty, is itself a new and distinctive form of goodness. The biblical story as the origin of the scientific outlook. I have looked at two Middle Eastern stories of origin. One, the Babylonian, belongs to an extinct religion. The other, the biblical, is still with us. One roots all things in primal chaos, and sees humans as playthings of the gods, implicated in the conflicts of spiritual forces that are continually at work in the natural world, in storms and earthquakes, in fertility and human warfare. The other carries many echoes of that view, but in its final form, probably compiled in the 6th century BCE, it roots all things in one God who envisages and actualizes creation because it is good. Humans, made in the image of that one God, must do the same. Envisage, actualize, and enjoy the good things of creation and keep the mysterious threat of the unbounded deep at bay. Between these two stories of origin there is a division that continues to exist in the most sophisticated, contemporary scientific accounts of the universe, the divide between chance and purpose. In the Babylonian account, the gods arise from the formless without any conscious intention. Human lives are determined by the conflicts of the gods, which, again, depend on chance outcomes of a perpetual supernatural contest for power. In such a worldview, there are religious practices, devotion to gods for the sake of avoiding harm and gaining good. There may be a strong sense of spiritual presences, both beneficial and dangerous, but there is little or no incentive to see the natural world as rational or intelligible, or to see religion as in any way connected with a rational or scientific view of the world. The gods are as petty and capricious as human beings, but they live longer and are infinitely more dangerous. In the biblical story, the whole universe arises by a conscious intention to bring many forms of goodness, of beauty, elegance, and intelligibility into being. So there is a reason for the existence of the universe. The basic reason is that it is worthy of contemplation and understanding for its own sake. Creatures exist who recognize and appreciate beauty and goodness, and they thereby increase the sum of goodness in existence. The universe is an intelligible, rational order that can be understood and appreciated by creatures who are made in the image of the rational Creator. Events in the universe are not capricious or truly random. They are parts of an ordered structure and can in principle be explained and understood. The biblical view of origins makes religious practice much more compatible with a scientific study of nature, a study that presupposes that nature is intelligible and comprehensible by the human mind. Of course, the Bible was written long before modern science existed, so we should not expect it to include any strictly scientific content. What we get, however, is the intellectual foundation for future science, in the idea of one rational orderer of the whole of nature, who desires the universe to exemplify intellectual beauty and creates human beings, and perhaps other intelligent creatures too, to appreciate and understand it. 3 problems with the biblical story. Things seem to be going rather well for the biblical account of origins, but there are some problems which many skeptical modern scientists are not slow to point out. I shall mention 3 major problems. One is that this account assumes that the existence of the universe is good. Because of the amount of suffering and pain in the world, some people doubt whether this universe could have been created for the sake of goodness. The hypothesis does not seem to fit the facts. A second problem is that the account assumes the universe has a purpose. But given the vast amount of empty space, the tiny amount of time for which humans have existed, and the fact that the whole thing will run out of energy sooner or later, some people doubt that any purpose can be seen in the universe at all. A third problem is that introducing God does not solve the problem of origins. It just puts it one stage further back. For how did God come into being? Is God not even more complicated and mysterious than the universe? And if so, how can God really explain anything? This is a bit of a blow to those who accept the biblical account of creation. Is there any way in which believers could respond? The first problem is that the universe is not really good. Many writers have thought that it would be better for the universe not to exist. There is so much suffering and destruction in the universe that it is a pity it is there at all. And maybe it is not quite so intellectually beautiful after all. It may be rather messy and chaotic, and we are just lucky that some of our scientific theories have worked rather well so far. It may all go wrong quite soon, and we will discover that we cannot get any coherent scientific explanations for the universe after all. Perhaps, some cosmologists think, this orderly part of the universe is just a tiny part of a much larger mega-universe, most of which is chaotic. Part of what this shows is that many scientists do have a lot of faith, quite as much faith as religious believers. The scientists' faith is that the universe is really comprehensible through and through. It does have intellectual beauty. As the Cambridge quantum physicist Paul Dirac remarked, the fundamental equations of quantum theory were selected largely because of their mathematical beauty. Perhaps that faith is misplaced. Already, at the time of this writing, there are basic problems about making relativity theory and quantum theory consistent, and perhaps the basic principles of nature are quite beyond us. If you think the universe is an anarchical mess, beyond the grasp of science, you will probably not favor the hypothesis of a rational creator. On this point at least, some scientists and some religious believers can make common cause and affirm their common faith that the universe is intelligible, a rational and comprehensible whole. The other part of this problem is the age-old problem of why there is so much suffering in the universe. This is such a major problem that I will be returning to it when dealing with some of the other big questions. For the moment I will just admit that if you think it really would be better if the universe did not exist, that is a good reason for thinking there is no Creator God. A believer in creation must assert that, in some way, suffering, or the possibility of suffering, is necessary to this universe, and that it can be sufficiently compensated for or overcome. The Babylonian postulation of a primeval deep is perhaps meant to assert this, and possibly science can show that chaos and destruction are necessary to the structure of the universe. For instance, without the immensely destructive explosions of stars, heavy elements like carbon, essential to life, could not form. And without the extinction of dinosaurs, humans could never have come to exist. It is possible that a greater understanding of the complex interplay between the fundamental laws and forces of the universe will show how destruction and creation are necessarily bound together in the universe, and how no universe with beings like humans in it could otherwise exist. But, of course, it may not. And for many the question of whether an all-powerful God could have created a better universe without all this suffering remains unanswerable. The existence of suffering is a major objection to the hypothesis of a God who creates for the sake of goodness. The second problem is that many people cannot see that there is any purpose in the universe. Some even think that modern science shows there cannot be a purpose in the universe, for it shows that the role of chance and randomness is much too great for there to be any consciously designed purpose. The question of whether there is purpose in the universe is another big question, and I will deal with it in chapters 2 and 3. So for the moment I will put it aside, while accepting that if the universe really is without purpose or design, it would be very difficult to believe that it is the result of creation by a God. Can God be an ultimate explanation? The third problem with which this chapter is mainly concerned is that many people do not accept that God could be an ultimate explanation of the universe. If the universe is good, or even if there are sufficient good things in the universe, the existence of a God who envisages good and decides to make it actual would explain why the universe exists. But what would explain the existence of God? Would such a God not be even more complex and problematic than the universe itself? So how does the fact of God help to explain the universe? This is a variant of Bertrand Russell's question, allegedly addressed to his nanny when he was 5. Who made God? The traditional answer is that God, like mathematics, is not the sort of thing that can be made, that can come into being or pass away. God is, in fact, more like the formless deep than it may have seemed. Boethius described God as the infinite ocean of being. God is a sort of limitless reservoir of all possibilities and is beyond all finite names and forms. From that ocean of possibility, particular things do arise, as in the Babylonian story, but they arise by conscious knowledge and choice. Who knows and chooses? Not a particular disembodied person with a particular personality and prejudices. That is much too anthropomorphic a view. Possibilities are stored in an unlimited consciousness. Each possible state of affairs has a value attached to it as part of what it is. The infinite consciousness is aware of each value, and if a possible state has a relatively high value, is good, that is a reason for bringing it into actuality. The ocean of possibility, thus, contains its own reason for existence. Possibilities, it may be said, can only exist in an actual being, and an actual being that contains possibilities sounds as if it has something very much like consciousness. That consciousness has good reasons for bringing some possible states into being, not by arbitrary whim, but by simply attending to the nature of all possible states. We might say, then, that the universe comes into existence because there is a good reason for it to exist, because it is good or contains overwhelmingly great goods. And the set of all possible states necessarily exists in an infinite consciousness in which alone possibilities are capable of existing. The reason God cannot be brought into being is that God is the necessary condition of anything being brought into being. There is something like what mathematicians call a phase space, a space of logical possibility that contains all possible states and that therefore cannot be other than it is, because the set of all possible things is exhaustive and cannot be added to or subtracted from. It is necessarily actual and is unique in being self-existent, in not deriving its existence from another. Being both actual and conscious, it knows what possible states are good and can be the source of their actuality. This can be called a choice because it is a selection of some possible states for actualization, but it is not a purely random choice or a choice without reasons. It is a wholly rational choice for the sake of goodness. Thus, the ultimate explanation of the existence of the universe is a combination of necessity and value. The unlimited ocean of possibility and the consciousness in which alone it can be contained is necessary. The coming into being of some possibilities is for the sake of their value. There can be no more complete an explanation for the universe than this. There are two main versions of such an explanation in the history of philosophy. G.F.W. Leibniz held that there is only one possible world that can exist, or that there is one best possible world that can exist. But Thomas Aquinas, holding that there is no such thing as one best possible world, believed rather that any universe that contains overwhelmingly great goods can be created. Some modern physicists would add that all such universes do, as a matter of fact, exist, and the more depressive among them hold that all possible universes exist. That is depressing because many of these worlds will be very bad indeed. Even the worst possible world will exist. If that is not depressing, it is hard to know what is. What are we to make of arguments like these? I think we all will agree that we are arguing at the edge of the capacity of the human intellect. How could finite minds be expected fully to understand the inner nature of necessity and value? Yet, if we are made in the image of the Creator, as Genesis says we are, we may have at least a hint of what an ultimate explanation would be like, even if we could not ourselves obtain the final explanation. These arguments, or arguments very much like them, have been used by Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Anselm, Descartes, Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, and by many other philosophers. Quite an impressive list. But some people still feel that this is all just playing with words. It is nonsense to talk of something existing by necessity. Anything at all can either exist or not, and that is that. Talk of possibilities somehow existing, or even worse, existing in some disembodied consciousness, is nonsense. We know that consciousness is caused by very complex physical brains and cannot exist without them. Worst of all, this is metaphysics in the old bad sense. It is not verifiable or falsifiable by observation. It has no theoretical consequences, and so it is vacuous. It does not explain anything, since an explanation has to tell us exactly how and why something happened. But this alleged theory does not actually explain why anything in particular happens, why the sky is blue, why elephants have large ears, or why dogs bark. It has no consequences. It is, therefore, not even a proper theory. These are certainly powerful points, enough to make many people feel that ultimate questions about the origin of everything are meaningless or useless. All explanations, it may be said, must stop somewhere. The best we can hope for is to find the simplest set of laws of nature and the simplest set of physical states, and then say that they just exist, and that is that. No further explanation is possible. Nothing can explain itself, so there must be a final brute state that is beyond explanation. Indian religious stories of the origin of all things. Some religious views, most notably Buddhism and Chinese religions like Confucianism and Taoism, accept such a view. It is not for us, they say, to address such ultimate questions, which are irrelevant to the practical problem of eliminating suffering where we can, and finding a way of living in harmony with the balance of the universe, freed from suffering, hatred, greed, self-delusion, and attachment. Still, even such religious views do make claims about the nature of ultimate reality. For instance, Buddhists generally believe in rebirth, and think that humans have had many past lives in different forms. We may not know what our first origin was, but according to Buddhists, we do know that we have had many lives, and that what we are now is a result of what we did then. Confucians believe in a way of heaven, a moral order that is built into the universe. In other words, these religions deny a purely materialistic view of the universe, a view that the universe is morally indifferent and purely random or accidental. There is a spiritual or mental reality, whether it is called the will of heaven or nirvana, the state of liberated existence. And there is a moral law, a set of rewards and punishments for conduct built into the universe. It might be said to be the most general and basic religious belief that there is a moral causal order in the universe, and that there is a non-physical or spiritual aspect to the universe. The point of human life is to live in conformity with a moral order and in union with spiritual reality. This is far removed from a materialist philosophy, yet it is a philosophy, a belief about what sorts of things ultimately exist and about how human beings ought to live. But no attempt is made at an ultimate explanation of origins, of how things came to be as they are, or of how they began. In fact, the whole idea of a beginning of the universe is often denied, especially in the Indian religious traditions from which Buddhism sprang. These traditions are set out in the Upanishads, a major part of the scriptures of orthodox Hinduism, thought by traditional believers to have been dictated by the gods to ancient seers. The Upanishads are both complex and diverse in the approaches they take, but their central doctrine is that the whole universe is the manifestation or expression of Brahman, the absolute reality. Brahman is not a reality separate from the universe. It is the inner nature of the universe itself. Brahman is the life that shimmers through all contingent beings. It consists of all things. It is the reality of which all physical things are appearances. That reality is certainly not physical. Brahman is understanding, bliss. It has the nature of consciousness and enjoyment. As such, it could well be termed the supreme good, since it finds complete satisfaction in the contemplation of all possibilities in its own self. It is, as Aristotle put it in the Metaphysics, Book 12, noesis noesios, literally, thought that thinks itself. A reality that is supremely happy in the contemplation of its own perfection. This is very similar to the classical Christian and Jewish and Muslim idea of God as a being of supreme perfection or goodness. But in the Indian tradition, it is thought of not as a reality distinct from the universe, but as the ultimately real nature of the universe itself. And so the key question is not about how the universe began, was it originated by a spiritual God, but about what reality underlies the appearances of space and time. It does not matter to Hindus whether the universe began or not. In fact, it is usually thought that this space-time is only one of an infinite series of space-times. This space-time may have had a beginning, and it may move through a set of phases, or ages, usually from better to worse, until it ceases to exist. But if so, it was preceded by an infinite number of other space-times, and it will be succeeded by an infinite number after it. All of them are manifestations of Brahman, the only ultimate reality. Yet each universe may be thought of as created by Brahman. It was being alone that was this in the beginning, one only, without a second. This being thought, "Would that I were many." He knew that he was creation, for he had brought it all forth, hence he became creation. This points to what seems like a major difference between biblical and Indian views of creation. In the Bible, God creates a universe that is different from the divine being, but in the Upanishads, the creation is part of the divine being. The universe is, as the 12th century Indian sage Ramanuja put it, the body of the Lord. So, whereas the prophets of Israel tend to advocate worship of God as a distinct and superior reality by worshippers who are unworthy sinners, the seers of India tend to teach that all of us really are parts of God, and so divine. At the heart of each finite self is the divine self. This self, Atman, is Brahman indeed. The spiritual path of Upanishadic Hinduism is to overcome the illusory self, enmeshed in desires and self-delusions, and discover the true self, Atman, within, which is identical with the one supreme reality. The religious life is a journey from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, and from death to immortality. The Hindu doctrine of how humans originate is that we originate in and are parts of one supreme self of all. We have somehow become ignorant of this because of our selfish and materialistic desires. But through meditation and discipline we can achieve knowledge of our essential natures. Then, to him who has freed himself from ignorance, this same world of pain presents itself as essentially blissful. He sees himself as a plaything of Brahman whose nature is supreme bliss, as Ramanuja writes. If we ask about the reason for creation, Ramanuja says, "The highest self, desirous of providing himself with a variety of playthings, so modifies himself as to have those elements for his body." The word plaything is not a very happy translation, and we may prefer a term like companion, which I think renders the sense better. It is important to be aware that Ramanuja's is only one interpretation. Other interpreters, most notably Sankara, would disagree on many points. For Sankara, there is not a conscious decision on the part of the Creator to generate the universe. Rather, all finite names and forms arise from the One through ignorance, avidya, and they have the nature of illusion. They are not willed. They arise by necessity and have no positive purpose or goal that is to be achieved by means of them. The major differences in the Upanishadic traditions are about whether Brahman is more or less personal in nature, is a supreme lord or an absolute without qualities, about whether creation is positively willed or just occurs through a mysterious arising of ignorance, and about whether liberated souls merge into Brahman and cease to be individuals or will continue to exist in a liberated, more blissful realm. But most commentators on the Upanishads agree on the general explanatory scheme for the existence of the universe. This scheme is that there is one supreme reality of intelligent and blissful consciousness. It emanates from itself many worlds, in which beings become ignorant of their true identity with the Supreme Self. The law of karma, of moral cause and effect, causes souls to be reborn in many worlds. The spiritual goal is to be liberated from worlds of suffering and to re-establish identity with the Self. But worlds, that is, universes, will continue to exist, to be continually created and destroyed as souls work out their karma, and the Supreme Self becomes manifold, generating from itself an infinity of names and forms, perhaps out of Leela, the joy of creation, or perhaps out of a necessary fall into ignorance. The possibility of religious explanations of the universe. This sort of religious explanation is not vacuous. It makes some quite specific claims about the sorts of things that exist and about the past and future of human lives. There can be and are arguments about whether these claims are true, and that in itself shows that the claims are meaningful and that their content can be understood fairly well. But can they be verified or disproved? Not, it seems, by public observation and experiment. We cannot observe the coming into being of universes, and we certainly cannot observe a disembodied consciousness creating a universe. We can only publicly observe the physical. We may think a physical state is intelligently designed if it is amazingly complex, integrated, elegant, and beautiful, and if it seems to accomplish some worthwhile purpose. But such things cannot be established beyond reasonable doubt. The only real verification would be if we discovered in the future that we had been reborn many times, or if we found ourselves as blissful companions of Krishna, for many Hindus a finite embodiment of the Supreme Lord, or as one with the Supreme Self, in which case such intellectual puzzles would long ago have ceased to matter. As an old Buddhist saying puts it, if you have not found enlightenment, you could not understand the answer to your question. If you have found enlightenment, you would not ask the question. So, in proposing such a religious explanation for the universe, we are presupposing that there are meaningful questions that may be verifiable in principle, but that there is in this world no conclusive way of verifying or proving them false. This situation is not, however, all that unusual. A somewhat similar example from science would be the question of whether there is life in other space-times. We know what the question means, but there is no definitive way of answering it. In this situation, some would say that agnosticism is the only reasonable attitude. That may be so, but a Hindu would say that the real question is not about things that happened millions of years ago. It is about the nature of reality now, and about whether the forms of space and time are appearances of some deeper spiritual reality. It is about what the human self really is, and about its origins and destiny, why it is as it is, and what it may fear or hope for. Religious explanations do not provide exact predictions of publicly testable processes, but they offer explanations. They explain what the nature of reality is. It is at least partly spiritual. How humans have come to be as they are, how humans should act, and what the final goal of human life is. The trouble is that such explanations are very contentious, and none of them can be established beyond reasonable doubt. There are profound disagreements about whether spiritual reality exists at all, about how humans should act, and about whether there is any goal or purpose for human life. This does not mean they are not explanations, but it does mean that they are hypotheses that have not been definitively established and that always have to compete with other hypotheses. For some people, that lack of certainty and of conclusive evidence is enough to rule out all such explanations as moot, more like science fiction fantasies than like anything else. But others will think that we cannot avoid adopting some hypothesis about whether there is a spiritual origin and goal of human life, even if our favorite hypothesis is that there is not. We just have to do the best we can, with very ambiguous evidence. The spectrum of religious claims about the origin of the universe. The most general religious hypothesis is that there is a spiritual basis and goal for human existence. Within the spectrum of world religions, this hypothesis divides into three main religious attitudes. One is theism, prominent in the Semitic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and their derivatives. The universe originates in a conscious intention, and there is a good purpose for the existence of the universe. Religious believers should help to realize this purpose in loving obedience to the Creator's will. The second is absolute idealism, characteristic of some Indian traditions. According to this belief, the universe originates in one spiritual, intelligent or conscious reality. There may be no positive purpose in the existence of the universe, but it arises by necessity from the essential nature of Brahman, the Absolute. Religious believers seek to become conscious of their own inner identity with the self of all, and to be liberated from the illusion of being a separate, desiring ego. The third is dualism, or double-aspect monism, found in some forms of Buddhism and East Asian religions. The origin of the universe is unknown. Perhaps it has just always existed as a fundamental brute fact. But spirit exists in addition to matter, or as an aspect of matter. Accordingly, the religious quest is either to seek liberation from matter in a realm of pure spirit, to achieve liberation from the wheel of rebirth and enter into nirvana, or to apprehend and live in harmony with a moral and spiritual aspect of the material world, the way of Tian, heaven. The religious question of origins is not really about whether the universe had a beginning. It is about whether the whole of space-time and everything in it depends upon, originates in, a superior spiritual reality. Or, in the third religious view, whether there is a spiritual aspect to it that is vital for determining how humans should act. A supreme spiritual reality or a spiritual aspect of material reality could exist whether or not the physical universe has a beginning, so it might seem that the scientific question of whether the universe began is not relevant to the religious question. What matters is the nature of the universe now. For religious views, all material things are creations of, appearances of, or aspects of a spiritual state or being. The basic reason for believing this is not a purely speculative theory about the origin of the universe. It lies in claimed personal experience of liberation, freedom from egoism, and union with a spiritual reality of supreme goodness. When this is the experience of another person who claims to have achieved liberation, or to have intense knowledge of God's will, or of unity with the self of all, it takes the form of revelation, a teaching accepted on the authority of someone we believe to be more closely related to spiritual reality than we are. It is such claims to personal experience that make belief that the universe originates in something like a supreme consciousness more than an abstract hypothesis. No public testing of such claims is possible, since they are claims to apprehend a reality that is not physical, and that therefore usually has no publicly observable aspect. But personal experience, especially when widely corroborated by others who are not sick or insane, and when accompanied by a positive transformation in the moral and affective quality of one's life, is a form of evidence, one that can be overwhelming to those who have it. This is very unlikely to convince a skeptic, who will dismiss such claims to personal experience of a purely spiritual reality as unreliable and unverifiable, or even as delusions. There are no such spiritual realities, the skeptic will say. The natural sciences provide an account of the origins of the universe that needs no appeal to spiritual considerations, and that makes them both superfluous and implausible. The scientific search for a final theory. At this point I will turn from religious explanations to scientific explanations of the beginning of the universe. Most competent scientists agree on the account of the origin of the universe that modern cosmology provides. There seems to be plenty of evidence to suggest that our universe began to exist about 13.7 thousand million, an American but not a British, billion years ago. From a microscopically minute region of stupendous heat and energy, without any consciousness, without any stars or planets, without even any subatomic particles, the material universe exploded into being. As it expanded and cooled, the first wave particles, photons, neutrinos, and positrons came into being. Over the next few 100,000 years, atoms formed, condensed to form stars and galaxies, and, in the nuclear furnaces of the stars, forged the heavy elements like carbon that were to become the basis of life. Many cosmologists, however, are unhappy at the thought that the universe begins from an initial singularity, a one-time event that precedes all the laws of physics and, thus, does not fall under any of them. Stephen Hawking has proposed that, in the very early universe, the dimension of time becomes more and more space-like, so that there is no need for a first moment of time to be explained. Edward Tryon suggested in 1973 that, since positive, rest mass and kinetic energy, and negative, gravitational energies precisely balance one another, the universe may have come into being as a random quantum fluctuation from a zero-energy state. Thus the universe might be a free lunch, and we could get the ultimate human dream, something for nothing. In quantum theory, particles flash into and out of existence, and the early universe is small enough to act in accordance with quantum laws, So the whole universe may have quantum fluctuated into existence and frozen, at least for a while, a few billion years it turns out, into a physically enduring material system. Such theories aim to show how something could come from nothing, but do they really do so? Quantum theory consists of a very complex set of laws, and it does not seem sensible to say that the counterbalancing of positive and negative forces is equivalent to nothing at all. This zero-energy state is full of forces that balance each other exactly, and it is a very dynamic and constantly changing state. It may look as though the universe has progressed from a very simple initial state to its present complex structure, but it is doubtful whether the initial state was simple at all. True, it did not consist of complex and integrated physical structures. There were not huge numbers of particles organized in intricate arrays, so it was simple in physical structure and complexity. Even then, however, we now believe that the early universe contained dark matter and dark energy, so things were not as simple as they might have been. Quantum theory utilizes an extremely complex set of laws, dimensions, possibility states, and fluctuating energy fields of various sorts. It involves Hilbert spaces, operators, commutators, symmetry groups, the Dirac equation and interaction potentials, Lagrangians and Hamiltonians, broken symmetries and associated particles. That does not seem very simple. Can it really be said that, at the Big Bang, there were just a few simple laws and particles? No, because there were no particles at all. And without particles, how or where were the laws supposed to exist? Perhaps they did not exist, but just suddenly came into being out of nothing. But if something can come into being out of nothing, and I mean really nothing, not some sophisticated balance of physical energies, it does not really matter whether it is complex or simple. It is not easier for a simple state to come into being than for a complex state to do so. In fact, since there are infinitely more complex states than simple states, it seems more probable that a complex state would come into being, if probability had any sense here at all. The idea that a simple state is more likely to come into being possibly arises from the physical principle of minimal effort. Nature uses minimal effort to do what it does. But when nature does not even exist yet, that principle cannot exist either. If absolutely nothing exists, no states and no principles or laws, then it is impossible to say what might come into existence and whether it will be simple or complex. This seems to imply that there could be no reason for the first state of the universe. And that is deeply unsatisfying for a physicist, since a fundamental belief of physics is that there is a reason for everything. So, if there is no reason for the Big Bang, physics seems to have met its nemesis. Some would just say, so what? You can't hope to explain everything. And there just is no reason for the existence of the universe. Once you have explained how all its parts interact, there is nothing left to do. As Karl Popper wrote, there can be no explanation which is not in need of a further explanation. So there can be no such thing as a final or ultimate explanation. But others feel that there has to be a reason for the Big Bang, or the whole basis of science, a belief that we can explain the universe, is undermined. So some cosmologists look for laws and energy states that precede or lie outside of the physical universe, that just have to be what they are, to which there is no alternative. Such laws, like the basic axioms of number theory, would just have to be what they are. Sooner or later they will generate a universe, or perhaps many universes, of which this is just one. Einstein made this point by saying, "The enterprise of physics is to reach as far as possible the utopian and seemingly arrogant aim of knowing why nature is thus and not otherwise. Thereby one experiences, so to speak, that God himself could not have arranged these connections in any other way." Stephen Weinberg, in Dreams of a Final Theory, writes, "It is possible that there is only one logically isolated theory, a theory so rigid that there is no way to modify it by a small amount without the theory leading to logical absurdities, that is consistent with the existence of intelligent beings." All attempts to provide an explanation for the Big Bang, however, seem to end by saying that underlying our present universe there is something beyond our space and time, something very mysterious, sets of quantum laws, and where are they supposed to be, and complex energy states, and what is energy really? We are almost back to the Babylonian primal deep. The idea of necessity. And there is something very interesting about the modern cosmological quest. It is looking not just for a primal chaos, but for a deep mathematical structure that has to be the way it is, that necessarily exists and from which the physical universe arises. And that brings us back to one of the big objections to God as an ultimate explanation, that all existence is contingent, that there is nothing that has to be the way it is. Perhaps modern cosmology is more concerned with necessity than we might think. And why, after all, does all existence have to be contingent? Is that a necessary truth? The main reason seems to be the one proposed by the philosopher David Hume, that we can always imagine anything not existing. As for mathematics, some think that is simply a set of things that are true by definition, so it does not tell you anything about reality. In slightly more technical terms, if something X exists by necessity, then it must exist in every possible world. But we can always conceive of a world without X, so such a world is possible, and it does not have X in it. Therefore there can be nothing that exists by necessity. This argument convinces many. The philosopher Richard Gale uses it in his book On the Nature and Existence of God. But others might point out that, contrary to what David Hume thought, the fact we think we can conceive of a world without X does not show that such a world is possible. We can very easily imagine an impossibility, as when we imagine finding a square exactly equal in area to a given circle. Perhaps we cannot imagine what makes something necessary. But there is no contradiction in saying that there is an X that exists in every possible world. If there is such a possible X, while we might think we can imagine a world without X, in fact there could be no such world. There is no obvious contradiction in saying either that there cannot be such a world, or that there can. So we are stuck. We do not know whether a necessary being is impossible or not. Has that got us any further forward? Well, it does imply that we are in no position to say that we know a necessary being is impossible, that all existence is contingent. We do not know what the conditions of necessity are, but if there were some necessary laws, that would give a reason for their existence, the reason being that there is no alternative. They have to be. The peculiar thing about such necessary ultimate laws is that, in many ways, they seem to be possibilities rather than actualities. That is, they say what would have to happen if there were a physical universe. They lay out a set of future possibilities, and some physicists think there is in the end just one set, the set of all possible universes. If that were true, we might have hit upon something that would give us a reason for thinking that there is an ultimate necessary basis for the existence of the universe. It would be the exhaustive set of all possible universes, which could not possibly be other than it is. The primacy of consciousness. At just this point, the religious hypothesis takes on a new and perhaps unexpected relevance. The hypothesis that consciousness is an ultimate element of reality, even perhaps the only ultimate reality. Physical science has not usually concerned itself with that claim, precisely because it is a physical science concerned with the physical, the publicly observable, measurable, and repeatable. Consciousness is not physical, publicly observable, precisely measurable, or controllable in laboratories. Moreover, scientists can usually ignore it, and when they talk about the origin of the universe, they are talking of its purely physical origin. However, in physics these days things are not so clear. Some quantum physicists, John Wheeler and Henry Stapp, for example, are impressed by the fact that electrons are probability waves that only collapse into locatable particles when a measurement is taken or when an observation is made. This leads them to say that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of physical reality after all. Perhaps consciousness cannot be considered just a byproduct of the physical activity of the brain. Perhaps consciousness has to be present for there to be an actual physical world containing brains at all. This is certainly a controversial view. All quantum physicists would agree that what we see is a function of what sort of interaction we have with the physical environment. We see things only as they appear to us as observers. But many would not go along with saying that, therefore, consciousness is necessary to the existence of the physical world as we see it. Maybe, they would say, the physical world is stranger than we thought. But it may still be purely physical in its constitution, even if the physical is very odd stuff indeed. But if you do think that consciousness is fundamental to the existence of physical reality, this raises the possibility that some sort of consciousness is needed to make the universe actual. This would be a cosmic consciousness, a consciousness without a body. But out of what would it make some states actual, and in accordance with what laws? All consciousness requires objects, things of which it is conscious. One hypothesis is that the cosmic consciousness primordially consists of all possible states. Those are the primary objects of its consciousness. It is indeed very odd to think of merely possible things as somehow actually existing. So quantum physicists are very puzzled about how electrons can exist as probability waves in Hilbert space when they are not being observed or measured. However, one way in which we know possibilities can exist is as conceived by some mind. We can all think of possible states of affairs, and those states exist, but only as possibilities in our minds. So, in addition to being necessary for the actual existence of any physical states, the cosmic consciousness might be necessary for the set of all possible states to exist, for all the laws of nature that govern relations between possible future states to exist, and for merely potential realities to have some form of real, consciously conceived existence. According to this hypothesis, the real basis of the physical universe is conceptual, or mathematical. Mathematical possibilities exist in a cosmic consciousness, and it is that consciousness which, being necessarily actual, can give actuality to some of those possible states and laws. Some hard-headed mathematicians are impressed by this hypothesis. Roger Penrose wrote, "Although I had not explicitly asserted in either Emperor, the Emperor's New Mind, or Shadows, Shadows of the Mind, the need for mentality to be ontologically fundamental in the universe, I think that something of this nature is indeed necessary." From consciousness to a physical universe. But why should some possible states be actualized? It may be that there is only one set of laws that can give rise to a physical universe like the one we have, or to any enduring universe at all. Maybe it is just necessary for some universe to be actualized. Maybe there is, in fact, no difference between the possible and the actual, and every possible, conceived universe is also actual. We are in just one of these universes. Or, if there is only one consistently enduring possible universe, we are in it. We have to be in it. We have no choice. It is all necessary. However, there is another important consideration. Once consciousness has been introduced, it may occur to us that consciousness not only registers the existence of its objects. It normally has a reactive response to those objects, either of appreciation and pleasure, or of dislike and avoidance. We are not usually neutral about the objects of our consciousness. We like some and dislike others. We enjoy some and shun others. This is not just an arbitrary, subjective reaction. Some objects, some possible states, just are more worthwhile, valuable, or desirable than others. Pleasure is more desirable than pain, happiness than sadness. Knowledge is more desirable than ignorance, understanding than misunderstanding. Beauty is more desirable than chaos, creativity than destructiveness. Love is more desirable than hate, cooperation than obstruction. There might be arguments about details, and much room for personal preferences, and for selections of relative importance among these values. But in general, there is little argument about some states being more desirable than others. We can, after Aristotle, call states that are objects of rational desire good. Then any conscious being has a reason to choose good states rather than bad ones. In general, that a state is good is a good reason for choosing it. We now have a principle for the actualization of some possible states, which turns out to be very much like the biblical principle enunciated in the book of Genesis. A rational consciousness would choose them for their goodness. It follows that such a consciousness will choose the best set of possible states for itself. It will be supremely good and desirable, supremely wise, beautiful and happy. It will be supreme objective goodness, the blissful contemplation of what is supremely worthwhile just for its own sake. Perhaps choice is not quite the right word here, for that might give the impression that God first thinks about what is good and then chooses to be good, which God might not have done. But the choice that a being of supreme goodness should exist is a choice or selection that follows immediately from the nature of the set of all possible states. The supremely good follows from its own possibility just because it has, as John Leslie has put it, an intrinsic ethical requiredness. the supreme good is necessarily actualized in the perfection of the divine being itself. But there are other factors that do not quite have this element of absolute necessity. For instance, if love and cooperation are great goods, a cosmic consciousness will also have good reason to actualize other conscious beings whom it can love and cooperate with, though that reason may not be absolutely compelling. Perhaps the actual existence of a material universe can be an object of further appreciation and give scope for the exercise of fuller creativity. While there may, or may not be, a requirement that some such universe should exist, this introduces scope for creative choice, both in which universes to make actual and in how exactly to relate creatively to those universes. We now have two reasons for the existence of a physical universe, a principle of necessity and a principle of selection for the sake of goodness. These two principles, necessity and value, form an intelligible reason and, I think, the only intelligible reason for the existence of the universe. We are in no position to know precisely how far things exist by necessity and how far they are selected for value. We can only say that the primal consciousness is necessary to the existence of the set of all possible states, which is necessarily what it is. And the universe arises from it partly by necessity and partly because it is evaluated as good. That is a truly ultimate explanation for the universe. Are quests for ultimate explanation properly scientific? This seems like a rational hypothesis, but for some physicists it goes too far beyond physical theories. It does not give rise to any specific testable predictions. It introduces the idea of a non-physical consciousness, which is unnecessary and possibly incoherent, and it postulates a new and very complex cosmic consciousness, which only complicates the original simplicity that scientists like. It is true that this is not a hypothesis that can be tested by experiment. If it has a virtue, it lies in its theoretical elegance and comprehensiveness. That is, it says there is just one consciousness whose nature has to be what it is, and that accounts for the existence of all physical things. It does so by resorting to just two principles, necessity and value. That makes it an elegant and simple hypothesis. It is a theory about what sorts of things there are and why they exist, a theory that has traditionally been called metaphysical. It says that there are basically two sorts of things, material and spiritual, that the spiritual exists by necessity and produces the material by a combination of necessity and value. There are considerations that count in favor of this hypothesis: the mathematical elegance, intelligibility and beauty of the universe, the seeming necessity of the laws of nature, the feeling of objective moral obligation, and alleged apprehensions of a personal presence or consciousness greater than any finite consciousness, but one present in and through many finite objects and events. There are also considerations that count against the hypothesis: the existence of great suffering, what some feel to be the apparent pointlessness of existence, the role of chance in the evolution of organic life, and the difficulty of believing that consciousness can exist without any material basis. In the end, one set of these considerations will prove decisive. The presence of God may become overwhelmingly apparent to all, or the universe will simply expire and everything will cease to be as randomly and inexplicably as it came into being. But we, living in the middle of this cosmic drama, cannot see either its ultimate origin or its end. We can only speculate. From a scientific viewpoint, we can trace the universe back to its origin in the Big Bang. There, the strictly scientific quest ends with a basic set of laws and a physically non-complex initial state. But to assert that these basics tell us the true nature of reality and its ultimate origin is to move beyond experimental science into metaphysics. The God Hypothesis. The metaphysics of materialism claims that everything that exists is ultimately material. Consciousness, value, meaning and purpose are either reducible to the material events in animal brains, or they somehow emerge from material events as epiphenomena, accidental byproducts of material processes with no causal role to play in the way things are, and certainly with no part to play in the origin of the universe. Materialism is one member of a set of logically possible theories about the nature of the universe. This set, I do not imply that it is the only possible set, but it is exhaustive within its stated limits, posits the following. Either everything ultimately has the nature of spirit, idealism, or it is purely material, reductive materialism, or spirit and matter both exist more or less independently, dualism and double-aspect monism, or spirit emerges from matter, emergent materialism, or matter emerges from or wholly depends on spirit, theism. The universe is so complex, and our knowledge of it so limited, that all these theories have something to be said for them. Physical science is only concerned with the physical side of things, so we might think it is not committed to any of these theories. It does not have to deny the existence of spirit. But there are some scientists who think that science on its own gives a completely adequate account of the universe, and it gives the only testable account, so they find in the success of science a reason for embracing materialism. Yet this view is in turn hotly contested. Some scientists think that materialism gives an unduly restricted account of what science itself has discovered about the universe. Perhaps most practicing scientists think that science is in no position to come to a firm conclusion on such arcane matters. Materialism is immensely counterintuitive. It conflicts with our common-sense view that all human knowledge begins from personal experience, that we have thoughts and feelings that no one else can observe, that we are free to plan the future, and that our intentions make a real difference to the world. In short, materialism has a major problem with consciousness. It is the problem of how something that seems so obviously non-material, not located in public space and not observable by others, actually is material in some very subtle way. But there are plenty of materialists who are confident they can solve the problem. The main basis for this confidence is the enormous success in modern study of the brain and the rise of computing and artificial intelligence. These matters will be dealt with in more detail in Chapter 6, where I will suggest that materialist accounts are more matters of faith than of established scientific fact. The materialist faith is that one day a complete materialistic account of all mental phenomena will be given, in which consciousness is explained in wholly material terms. If, however, such materialist proposals are felt to be implausible, and if consciousness is taken to be a fundamental and basic element of reality, then any account of the origins of the universe will have to include an account of the origin of consciousness, as well as that of matter. Matter may have originated with the Big Bang, but if we are trying to explain the origin of consciousness, we have to explain the capacity to understand, appreciate, and act creatively, since these are the crucial capacities of a conscious being. The simplest explanation posits just one being that unites all possible states in one consciousness, and that actualizes states by the use of one most general principle of selection. This being, God, is not a tremendously complex being. God has no physical structure at all. God knows and does lots of things. But divine knowledge is the uniting of all possibilities in one consciousness, and the divine act of creation is the selection of states for one basic reason. This is a form of unity that includes many states and principles in one all-inclusive and elegant whole, the organizing principles of which are as rational, elegant, and simple as possible. The exclusion of such a possibility rests on a determination not to allow that a pure consciousness could exist, and on an insistence that all consciousness must depend upon a physical structure that must be at least as complex as the physical reality of which it is conscious. The God hypothesis, however, is that consciousness can exist without any physical structure. Its simplicity consists in the uniting of all information in one consciousness and in the inclusion of all its actions under one governing intention, the creation of value. The materialist will respond that we know of no consciousness that is not the result of very complex brain activity. It is extremely unconvincing to suggest that there could be a consciousness without such a material basis. So, is the denial of a pure, immaterial consciousness just due to lack of imagination? Or is the assertion of such a consciousness due to a failure to take seriously enough modern scientific accounts of how consciousness arises gradually from simpler, purely material processes? That is another big question to which I shall return in Chapter 6. Religious and scientific cosmologies. It may seem that we have moved a very long way from the Babylonian, Hindu, and Genesis stories of the beginning of the universe to a rather abstract hypothesis about a pure consciousness that acts on purely rational principles. Such a hypothesis would have been incomprehensible in early human history, and the religious accounts tell a picturesque story in a way that can convey a profound spiritual message. Acceptance of modern cosmology does mean that all the ancient religious stories of origin are literally false, yet they may still point to the important truth of the primacy of spirit and to the possibility of finding human fulfillment by appropriate relation to spirit. Stories may be the best way of affirming such a truth, especially in a pre-scientific age, but they must now be complemented by our more accurate knowledge of the physical history of the cosmos, with which they were never primarily concerned. It is time to draw some conclusions about what religions and the sciences have to say about the origin of the universe. As to the physical beginning of the universe, there is general, though not quite universal, scientific agreement that the universe began with a state of extreme physical simplicity, a minute state of infinite mass and density, but also of enormous complexity and mathematical elegance in the laws governing its expansion into the universe we see today. In the light of this discovery, less than 150 years old, all ancient stories of the origin of the universe have been rendered obsolete as literal accounts. The book of Genesis, for example, which sees the earth as a disk floating on a great sea, the sky as a bowl on which the stars, sun, and moon are hung as lamps, and the first humans as living in a garden in which God takes an afternoon stroll, and in which apples are forbidden fruit, can clearly be seen to be a pre-scientific story that is literally false, but may still have a deep spiritual meaning. That spiritual meaning is well worth exploring in detail, for what it can tell about the relations of God, humanity, and the created order. But it does not compete with cosmology. It is not in the same ballgame. Nevertheless, in science, the question remains of what, if anything, came before the Big Bang, or of what, if anything, accounts for it. It is not clear that science can answer this question, or if this question can have any answer at all. Some cosmologists seek a theory of everything, some ultimate mathematical system that is necessarily what it is, and necessarily gives rise to this universe, and perhaps to other universes too. Among such mathematical physicists, some are materialists, perhaps better called naturalists, since we are no longer sure of what matter is. They see the universe as arising without any purpose or design. The universe may arise by some inner necessity, as a quantum fluctuation in a vacuum, perhaps. It then assembles structures of great integrated complexity by a quasi-computational process, putting itself up gradually by its own bootstraps into complicated and interesting arrays of events. Others find in the intricate order and integrated complexity of nature evidence of intelligence, though they rarely speculate further on this or see it as having any religious implications. Some mathematicians and quantum physicists, like John Wheeler, Roger Penrose, and Henry Stapp, incline to such a view, and Einstein famously spoke of the Old One as the great intelligence underlying the universe. But that intelligence, at least as far as physics goes, does not necessarily show any particular interest in human beings, who have just been thrown up inevitably in the cosmic process. Many cosmologists refrain from indulging in such speculations. They think there just have to be some ultimate brute facts that cannot be explained. Such facts should be as simple as possible, though to be honest no one knows why they should be simple. But appeal to mathematical realities and objective necessity is much too platonic, too metaphysical for them. There is quite enough to do without getting into all that. And there, scientifically, the matter rests. Conclusion. The question of spiritual reality. It is characteristic of religions to posit a spiritual reality or realities of consciousness and value, in conscious relation to which humans can find their proper fulfillment. Some religions, like Buddhism, are not concerned with origins and just accept the existence of a spiritual realm as given. For them, consciousness is one of the ultimate brute facts, and a theoretical desire for simplicity cannot be used to rule out things, like consciousness, that, to them, obviously exist. Some religions, like Indian non-dualism, Advaita, see the physical universe as arising from a supreme consciousness by necessity, and tend to think that some finite world has always existed, or that a succession of finite universes exists without beginning or end. The question of a beginning of the universe is not of great importance, But it is important that there is real mental or moral causality in the universe, so that souls can reap the consequences of their actions in accordance with the law of karma. Some physicists assert that appeal to such a spiritual law is not necessary to account for the universe, and that there is no evidence for its existence anyway. But it is hard for a physicist to assert that there is definitely no such law, because a complete and exhaustive account of all causes of events is not available, and may even be unobtainable in principle. But a physicist can say that a purely naturalistic account gives a better explanation of how the universe began than would mysterious, unmeasurable, and untestable laws of moral influence. The Semitic religions usually posit a beginning of the universe and say that our space-time originates by the creative act of a pure consciousness, God. Some, like Robert Russell, think that it is religiously significant that the universe had a beginning, for that points to an explanation in some reality beyond space-time, perhaps to a timeless intelligence. But, as Aquinas held, the universe can originate in, that is, be wholly dependent upon, God, whether or not it had a beginning. So the question of beginning is not really important. What matters is the dependence of the physical upon the spiritual, and that could well be without beginning. Creation, in other words, is not the beginning of the universe, but the dependence of the whole of space and time at every moment upon God. The really decisive split is between those who think the universe originates in consciousness, or that at least consciousness has significant causal effects in the universe, and those who think the universe originates in blind chance or blind necessity, and that the basis of causality is purely natural. Many scientists believe that cosmology has nothing in particular to say on this issue, though clearly cosmology is only concerned with the physical, non-conscious, or that at least consciousness has significant causal effects in the universe, and those who think the universe originates in blind chance or blind necessity, and that the basis of causality is purely natural. Many scientists believe that cosmology has nothing in particular to say on this issue, though clearly cosmology is only concerned with the physical, non-conscious aspects of the universe. Some are naturalists, asserting that science, and only science, can provide complete explanations for the existence of everything, explanations that are non-purposeful and non-conscious in nature. This position is in conflict with virtually all religious belief systems. This is a major area of possible conflict, though whether the conflict is between science and religion or between a particular naturalist philosophy and religion remains to be decided. And some cosmologists, and some of the most able, find a place for consciousness and intelligence in explanations of the origin of the universe. This hypothesis is of great interest to religious believers, but it has to be said that such cosmologists do not very often connect their hypotheses of origin with any particular set of religious beliefs. So, the answer to the question about the beginning of the universe is that this physical space-time began with a Big Bang, but there may be many other space-times as well as this one. The most important religious question is not really about the beginning of this universe, but about whether it, and any other universe, originates in, and depends at every moment upon, or relates to, a spiritual reality of consciousness and intelligence. To this question, there are three main responses from cosmologists. That is none of our business, definitely not, and it's a pretty good hypothesis. It is the third response that is of most relevance to religious believers, as it offers the prospect of a fruitful interaction between those believers who want a rational foundation for religion and those scientists who seek an ultimate and truly comprehensive explanation for the universe. But while this is a dream for some, it is a nightmare for others, who find religion offensive and dangerous. Is this question, after all, resolvable by cosmologists anyway? That is quite another question, and one I shall return to in Chapter 7.